Thank you, dear Chair, honorable members. Good afternoon to all of you from wherever you are connected to this video conference. I have already met many of you bilaterally over the last weeks and months, but I'm very happy, of course, to finally have the opportunity to meet with the Agri Committee as a whole, even though it is only virtually. You know that I am fully committed to the strong and special relationship between the Commission and the European Parliament. And this includes, of course, close cooperation with all committees which are concerned by my work as Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries. Environmental policy and agriculture policy need to go hand by hand. And I want to contribute to an open and constructive dialogue with farmers and support their efforts for a more sustainable agriculture. So thank you very much, Norbert, and thank you all for this invitation. I hope this exchange will be the first of many exchanges we will have over the next years. A lot has happened since we started our mandate. The coronavirus pandemic has affected not only our health and our lives, but has created unprecedented challenges for our health systems. And it has heavily shaken the European and global economies and the pillars of our internal market. While many countries have started to move towards deconfinement, my sympathy goes to all those who have suffered and are still suffering, and especially to those who have lost family members or friends. We still know very little about this virus, and it will take months and years to fully understand and correctly interpret the consequences and effects it is having on our lives, our economies and societies, and our environment. But I think we have already learned first lessons from this crisis. It has taught us the value of acting together with coordination and solidarity. 70 years ago, 70 years after Robert Schuman Declaration, this is more valid than ever. It has reminded us how powerful nature is and how important it is to keep the health of this planet, not least to protect our own health. And this crisis, the crisis has shown that we were not sufficiently prepared and that we have maybe not taken scientists' warnings seriously enough. The crisis has taught and encouraged us that behaviors, habits, and rules can change, and that they can change quickly and with immediate effect, also on our nature. Finally, the crisis has also shown us how dependent our agriculture is on seasonal workers or on import of feed, how dependent our economy is on primary resources from abroad, and how vulnerable our supply chains are in general. But it has also shown an impressive ability of the food supply chain, and especially of farmers, to adapt to these difficult circumstances in several countries. We have seen an increase in short supply chains and local consumption, bringing farmers closer to citizens. Farmers' collective efforts have made it possible to ensure the supply of food to citizens across the European Union, and they deserve all our recognition and appreciation. After several months of intense work, we adopted the new biodiversity strategy together with the Farm to Fork strategy on the 20th of May. They both contribute to the same basic goal, to enable our society to live within planetary boundaries, both now and in the future. We have indeed to think about the young generations and the type of world we will be handing them in the next few years. Among other things, operating within the planetary boundaries means ensuring that the way we produce food, whether at land or at sea, contributes to our health and well-being, but also to the health of the ecosystems and natural resources, which constitute the basis of our life on this planet. While many farmers already strive to produce sustainably, the system as a whole is presently far from sustainable. And we know that the environmental and climate footprint of the present EU food system exceeds planetary boundaries by a factor of 2. This undermines the future of our society, of our agriculture, and of our farmers, which desperately depends on healthy and productive soils and natural resources. We need a transformative change to ensure healthy food on our plates and proper income for farmers and fishermen and women. I have, of course, heard the voices who said that adopting the biodiversity strategy in the middle of the corona crisis would send a wrong signal. Let me explain why I did not share these views and why, after through discussions, the Commission has chosen exactly this moment to come forward with the strategy. Biodiversity strategy becomes more valid and more needed than ever, especially after seeing the impacts of this crisis and the vulnerable points of our societies and economies it has unveiled. Biodiversity protection and restoration is more relevant than ever, especially now, as we have just experienced how ecosystem damage can become a forceful contributor to the outbreaks of zoonotic diseases with dramatic consequences for all of us. No, sticking to our ambitious objective of the Green Deal does not mean creating obstacles for the society to recover from the biggest economic shock the EU and this world has ever seen. On the contrary, it means creating the conditions for our societies and economies to develop a much-needed resilience. The new biodiversity strategy tackles the key drivers of biodiversity loss, such as unsustainable use of land, overexploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. It is a central element of the EU's recovery plan, crucial not only to preventing and building resilience to future outbreaks of diseases, but also providing immediate business and investment opportunities for restoring Europe's economy. It also aims to make biodiversity considerations an integral part of EU's overall economic growth. The strategy is ambitious, yet balanced. It proposes, among others, to establish binding targets to restore damaged ecosystems and rivers, improve the health of EU protected habitats and species, bring back pollinators to agricultural land, reduce pollution, green our cities, enhance organic farming and other biodiversity-friendly farming practices, and improve the health of European forests. The strategy brings forward concrete steps to put Europe's biodiversity on the path to recovery by 2030, including transforming at least 30% of Europe's land and seas into effectively managed protected areas. The biodiversity strategy addresses a generational challenge to halt and reverse the decline of biodiversity, which is particularly severe on farmland. Science tells us that this is necessary and urgent to future-proof our agriculture systems. If we do not tackle the biodiversity and climate crisis, farmers will be the first ones to suffer from soil degradation, water scarcity, or disappearance of pollinators. In fact, farmers have been suffering from these challenges already for a number of years. The transformation of the way we produce food and manage our land will benefit farmers in the first place and will determine also the way they are perceived by citizens and consumers. The biodiversity strategy proposes that 10% of agricultural land should consist of high diversity landscape features. For instance, in the form of hedges or flower strips. The aim of this target is to bring back structural elements that have been so typical for our agricultural landscape and productivity over the centuries, but that have been lost over the last decades. Bringing back those landscape elements provides multiplied direct and indirect benefits for farmers and agricultural productivity, in particular in terms of pest control, enhanced pollination, fight against climate change, protection against soil erosion and fertility loss, as well as protection from floods. A quarter of agricultural land should be under organic farming by 2030. And the environmental impact of the agriculture sector should be significantly reduced by 2030. Organic farming is a European success story, with consumer demand growing faster than the production. In addition to being good for the environment, organic farming is also beneficial in economic terms. In most member states, the average organic farm makes more profit than the average conventional farm. And we want to increase the demand for organic food even further, which is why the Commission will also propose a new action plan for organic farming. Furthermore, the biodiversity strategy, together with the farm-to-fork strategy, proposes a reduction by 50% of the use and risk of pesticides, as well as of the use of the more hazardous and dangerous pesticides, a reduction by 50% in sales of antimicrobials used for farmed animals and aquaculture, a reduction by 50% of nutrient losses from fertilization, and it proposes to reverse the decline of pollinating insects. The different targets are mutually supportive. For instance, enhanced biodiversity facilitates biological pest control, which is good for organic farmers. A greater share of organic farming also facilitates reduction in pesticides use. I'm of course fully aware that some say this is too ambitious, too costly, and endangers food security. Let me try to explain why I completely disagree. The EU is the largest exporter of food in the world. Just before the COVID-19 crisis, food exports achieved record levels, with a trade surplus of 39 billion euros in 2019. And even in the first months of the crisis, agricultural export remained stable and increased compared to a year ago. There is certainly no risk that the EU could no longer feed itself. As I already said, if we do not tackle the biodiversity crisis, farmers will be the ones to suffer. By better protecting biodiversity, we actually ensure a long-term sustainable agriculture, which is key to preserving our food security also for the generations to come. Moving to agroecological practices actually reduces input costs, for instance, of pesticides and fertilizers. And in return, it provides benefits in terms of productivity through notably pollination and soil health. A higher share of organic production means also better prices for farmers. Improving the condition and diversity of agro-ecosystem will increase the sector's resilience to climate change, environmental risks, and socio-economic shocks. And at the same time, create new jobs, for example, in organic farming or in rural tourism and recreation. The impact of a modest yield reduction due to expansion of organic farming and set aside will be limited, especially if we take into account the measures announced in the farm-to-fork strategy to reduce food waste and promote dietary changes. The switch to less meat and milk-intensive diets will reduce the amount of land needed for production. I am fully aware that the transition towards sustainable farming models will be an opportunity, but also a challenge for many farmers, who will have to adapt to new techniques and business models, and this will require some efforts. As the key guardians of our land, the farmers play an absolutely essential role in preserving the EU's biodiversity. Without them, there is no biodiversity strategy. We need to have them fully on board. I want to reassure you that I take their concerns very seriously, and I have already engaged in several discussions with farmers' representatives, and I will do everything I can to convince them that this strategy was not established against them, but for them, that it will actually benefit the agricultural sector. I want the implementation of the strategy to be inclusive, and I will work hard to make sure that farmers can feel ownership for it. And I'm very encouraged by recent results of public consultations, which clearly show that most farmers do care for the environment. 57% of farmers give priority in the Common Agricultural Policy to support for environment and climate, while 64% think the CAP should do more to protect the environment. The reformed CAP will be an essential instrument to implement the biodiversity strategy on farmland. The new way of working through the national CAP strategic plans will allow member states to set their own CAP objectives based on their local conditions and needs. To receive income support, farmers will adhere to environmentally friendly practices and rules. The CAP proposals also put forward eco-schemes, which reward farmers for good environmental practices. The agro-environmental measures under rural development will also encourage sustainable agricultural practices. The Commission will pay particular attention to addressing in the CAP strategic plans the Green Deal targets, and those stemming from the biodiversity and farm-to-fork strategies, It will ask member states to set explicit national values for those targets, taking into account their specific situation and the above mentioned recommendation. Based on these values, the member states will identify the necessary measures in their strategic plans. We want to make sure that farmers are at the center of the transformation and that they have at their disposal all the necessary means and assistance to make the change. You will have seen that in its recently announced European Recovery Plan, the Commission proposed to reinforce the cap by additional 15 billion for rural development. It is in particular that the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development that will help farmers and rural areas to deliver the green transition and support investments and reforms, which will be essential to reach Europe's ambitious environmental targets. It will also help to strengthen the resilience of the agri-food sectors and to provide the necessary scope for crisis management. The Just Transition Mechanism will help support those most affected by making investment more attractive and proposing a package of financial and practical support worth at least 150 billion, as announced through the European Recovery Plan. And finally, the current cap as well as the future cap offer a wide range of instruments to support farmers in this transition, with benefits from them and their communities. The transformation we are proposing is necessary and unprecedented, but indeed it will only work if it's just and if it works for all. The biodiversity strategy will obviously also concern our oceans and seas. Oceans cover around 70% of our planet and are crucial to mitigate climate change. Nevertheless, if we want to be able to rely on oceans and seas for our fight against climate change and for seafood production, we must ensure that the marine ecosystems are healthy and resilient. And for the successful implementation of the biodiversity strategy in the oceans and seas, we will also need a contribution from the agricultural sector. The pollution of seas through nitrates and pesticides from the agricultural sector has a devastating effect on fish stocks, which has led to a de facto collapse of some key stocks in the Baltic Sea, for instance. The Baltic Sea is, of course, particularly close to my heart, and the very poor state of its health worries me greatly. That is why I have invited ministers for fisheries, agriculture, and environments from littoral member states to Lithuania to a conference that will organize on 28th of September to discuss how can we tackle the many challenges together. Only if environment, agriculture, and fisheries are looked at in a holistic way, and if the relevant actors take responsibility and talk to each other to find common solutions, will we be able to tackle the growing challenges for ecosystems and for the economic activities that depend on them, both at land and at sea. I also count on your support. Our efforts alone will, of course, not be sufficient. We need the world on board to halt biodiversity loss, and for that to happen, the EU has to lead by example. The biodiversity strategy launched a process to further improve biodiversity governance at all levels, and it will be the blueprint for the position the EU will take at the UN Summit on Biodiversity scheduled to take place in New York in September this year, and at the 15th Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in Kunming next year. Honourable members, I sincerely believe that investing in the successful implementation of the biodiversity strategy means investing in our, and especially our children's and grandchildren's life insurance. This is the path that science indicates to us. We should not allow today's COVID-19 crisis to compromise our green transition. We have to recover better from this crisis. This strategy is not the end of the process, but only the beginning. Discussions in the European Parliament and Council and with other stakeholders have just started. What matters is how we implement our ambitious goals. And this is what we will discuss and design together. I look very much forward to working closely and constructively with you all over the next weeks and months. Now, let me thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions the best I can.
Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner, for that introduction. As you can imagine, we have a great many questions, and